The moment Keanu Reeves stepped through the doors of the small-town veterinary clinic, time seemed too slow. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow over the waiting room. The air smelled of antiseptic medicine and the faint traces of worry that often accompanied such places. But Keanu wasn't focused on any of that. He could barely hear the murmur of quiet conversations, the shuffling of papers behind the front desk, or the clicking of a receptionist's keyboard. The only thing he could hear, the only thing that mattered, was the weak, struggling breaths of his dog in his arms. His German shepherd, his most loyal companion, was barely hanging on. His body was limp, his chest rising and falling unevenly, each breath more fragile than the last. Keanu had seen pain before. He had witnessed loss, had lived through tragedy. But this was different. This was his best friend. He had driven for miles, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with every labored whimper that came from the back seat. The moment he saw the sign for this clinic, he pulled in without a second thought. There was no time to check reviews, no time to ask questions. This was his only chance. Now, standing at the front desk, his heart pounded against his ribs as he faced the only person who could help. A veterinarian in his late 60s, neatly combed gray hair, a pristine white coat, stood flipping through a clipboard. His name was embroidered on his chest, Dr. Whitman. He looked like the kind of man who had been doing this job for decades, someone who had seen it all. And yet, as Keanu approached, the vet barely glanced up. "Excuse me," Keanu said, his voice controlled but urgent. "My dog needs help. He collapsed in the car. He's barely breathing. Please, can you take a look at him?" Dr. Whitman sighed, as if already burdened by the request. He kept his eyes on the clipboard, his pen tapping rhythmically against the paper. "Do you have an appointment?" The question hit Keanu like a slap. An appointment? Keanu blinked, momentarily thrown. He shifted his dog's weight slightly, feeling the faint tremors of his weakened body. Time was running out. "No," Keanu answered, his voice firm but calm. "I was passing through town when he collapsed. This was the first clinic I found." Finally, Dr. Whitman looked up. His eyes flickered toward the dog, then back to Keanu. For a split second, something unreadable passed across his face. But then his expression hardened. "I'm afraid we don't take walk-ins." The words were cold. Final. Keanu's grip tightened. He took a breath, steadying himself. Maybe the vet didn't understand. Maybe he hadn't realized how serious this was. "He's dying," Keanu said, his voice quieter now, but carrying the weight of something deeper. "I don't care about policies. I just need you to help him." Dr. Whitman sighed again, louder this time, as if the entire conversation was an inconvenience. Then he shook his head. "We don't take in strays." For a moment, Keanu didn't react. He wasn't sure he had heard correctly. A stray? Keanu looked down at his dog, the same dog that had been by his side through everything. The same dog that had comforted him in his loneliest moments, that had followed him faithfully from city to city, always watching over him. A collar gleamed faintly beneath the thick fur, the metal tag engraved with his name. A stray? Keanu looked back up, his piercing eyes locked onto the vet's. His voice was calm, but there was a sharpness to it now. "He's not a stray. He's my dog," Dr. Whitman shrugged. "We have rules here." His gaze swept over Keanu's appearance, the rugged clothes, the dust on his boots, the exhaustion in his eyes. And that's when Keanu understood. This wasn't about the dog. This was about him. The people in the waiting room had gone silent now. A few had lowered their magazines, their eyes flickering between the two men. Some of them recognized Keanu, but no one spoke. The young receptionist sitting behind the desk looked visibly uncomfortable, her fingers frozen above her keyboard. She wanted to say something, but she didn't. Keanu exhaled slowly. He had spent his life believing in kindness and helping people whenever possible. But here he was, standing in front of someone who had taken an oath to help animals and was refusing, just because of his own arrogance. The dog whimpered softly, a weak, helpless sound. Keanu's heart clenched. He gently stroked his dog's fur, whispering something only the animal could hear. Then he looked back at the vet, his expression unreadable. "If you don't want to help, just say it," Keanu said, his voice dangerously quiet. "But don't make excuses." For the first time, Dr. Whitman hesitated. It was barely a second, a flicker of uncertainty. But it was there. Then, just as quickly, he recovered. He shook his head, as if Keanu's words had no effect. "There's nothing I can do for you." The waiting room remained silent. A murmur spread soft, but growing. The old man sitting in the corner shook his head disapprovingly. The young woman with a cat in a carrier shifted in her seat, her lips pressed together. Even the receptionist looked like she wanted to disappear. Keanu studied the vet for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. He had faced obstacles before. He had been rejected, underestimated, even betrayed. But he had learned something through all of it. True character is revealed in moments like these, when people have a choice to do what's right or turn their backs. And this man, this so-called healer, had just turned his back. What Dr. Whitman didn't realize was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. And soon, he would regret it. Keanu Reeves took a deep breath as he stepped out into the cold night air, the door of the veterinary clinic closing behind him with a dull thud. His arms tightened around his dog, feeling the slow, weak rise and fall of its chest. The German shepherd, his most loyal companion, was barely hanging on. And the thought of losing him sent a wave of desperation through Keanu's body. He had faced challenges before, both on and off the screen, but nothing compared to the helplessness of watching someone he loved suffer while knowing he couldn't do anything to stop it. His heart pounded as he looked around, scanning the darkened streets for another option. The town was eerily quiet. Most businesses had already closed, their windows dark, their signs flipped to closed for the night. There were no cars passing by, no sounds of life, except for the faint buzz of a street lamp flickering above. Keanu clenched his jaw. There had to be somewhere else. Someone else. He wasn't ready to give up, but time was slipping away. He looked down at his dog, gently stroking his fur. "I've got you, buddy. Just hold on." Just as he was about to get into his car, the door to the clinic creaked open behind him. He turned sharply, half expecting Dr. Whitman to step out, to realize his mistake, to say something, anything that would make up for what he had just done. But it wasn't him. Instead, it was the young receptionist, her face pale, her hands shaking slightly. She looked back inside nervously before stepping fully out, hesitating for a brief moment before speaking. "Mr. Reeves," she said quietly, as if afraid someone might hear. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. That shouldn't have happened." Keanu didn't respond right away. He just studied her, his sharp eyes searching for something: regret, hesitation, maybe even guilt. She looked down at the dog in his arms, her expression softening with concern. "He looks really bad," she murmured, swallowing hard. "He needs help now." Keanu nodded, his voice calm but firm. "That's what I was trying to tell him." The girl bit her lip, glancing back toward the clinic, where the sound of shuffling papers and the occasional clatter of a drawer could still be heard. "Dr. Whitman," she started, then hesitated before sighing. He's been like this for years. He only helps regulars, people he knows, people with money, people he thinks are worth his time. Her voice was filled with frustration, but also fear. Keanu could tell she wanted to say more, but she was holding back. But what he did to you, that was wrong. For the first time since stepping into the clinic, Keanu felt a shift. He had spent his entire life believing in kindness, in doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. But tonight, he had come face to face with a man who had taken an oath to heal, yet refused to help because of his own arrogance. And now, here was this girl, who had nothing to gain, risking her job just to say she knew it was wrong. He respected that. Then she did something unexpected. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and looked him straight in the eyes. "There's another vet," she said hurriedly. "A few miles outside town. He's retired now, but he still helps animals when he can. He's a good man." Keanu's grip on his dog tightened. This was it. His only chance. He nodded without hesitation. "Where is he?" "I'll take you," she blurted out, then quickly looked back at the clinic, as if expecting Dr. Whitman to storm out and fire her on the spot. When nothing happened, she exhaled, pulling her car keys from her pocket. "Follow me." Keanu didn't need to be told twice. He rushed to his car, carefully laying his dog down in the passenger seat, securing him with a soft blanket he had in the back. His hands were shaking slightly as he started the engine. His dog let out another weak whimper, and Keanu clenched his jaw, glancing at him for a brief moment before pressing down on the gas. He wasn't going to lose him. Not like this. The girl's old sedan pulled out of the parking lot, her taillights glowing red in the darkness. Keanu followed close behind, his hands gripping the steering wheel tight. Every second that passed felt like a countdown. He could feel the weight of it, pressing against his chest, filling his mind with worst-case scenarios. He glanced at his dog again, his best friend, his protector, the one soul who had never left his side. His breathing was slowing. Too much. Too fast. Keanu's foot pressed harder on the gas. The road outside town was winding and dark, with only the headlights cutting through the thick blackness of the night. The girl's car in front of him swerved slightly to avoid a pothole, but she was keeping a steady speed. Keanu forced himself to breathe, to focus. They were almost there. Then, in the distance, he saw it, a small house with an old wooden sign swinging gently in the wind. The words were faded, but still visible. Dr. Harris Veterinary Care. Relief washed over him, but he knew it wasn't over yet. He pulled up behind the girl's car, throwing his door open before she had even turned off her engine. She jumped out as well, rushing to knock on the front door. Keanu lifted his dog into his arms again, his heart racing as he approached the porch. The lights inside flicked on. A shadow moved past the window. Then the door creaked open, and an elderly man with kind but tired eyes stood before them. He took one look at the dog in Keanu's arms and stepped aside immediately. "Bring him in," Dr. Harris said. No hesitation. No questions. Keanu didn't waste a second. He stepped inside, feeling a rush of hope for the first time that night. Little did he know, the events of this night weren't just about saving his dog. They were about to expose a truth that would shake the entire town. Keanu Reeves stepped into the dimly lit room, his arms still cradling his weakening dog. The warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the cold night outside, and for the first time in hours, there was a flicker of hope in his chest. The old veterinarian, Dr. Harris, stood before him, his eyes sharp but kind, already assessing the situation before a word was spoken. He didn't ask for paperwork. He didn't question where the dog had come from. He simply gestured toward a worn-out examination table. "Lay him down," he said. Keanu moved swiftly, his hands gentle but urgent as he placed his dog on the table. The German shepherd let out a soft whimper, barely moving. Dr. Harris wasted no time, his hands moving with experience as he examined the animal's breathing, his heartbeat, his pale gums. The young receptionist who had led Keanu here hovered nearby, her eyes wide with concern. The old vet exhaled deeply, reaching for his stethoscope. "He's in bad shape," he murmured. "But it's not too late." Keanu nodded, his jaw tight. He had spent the past hour fighting against time, fighting against the arrogance of a man who had refused to help, fighting against the fear that he might lose one of the most important souls in his life. Now, finally, he had found someone willing to do what was right. Dr. Harris worked quickly, drawing up an injection, his hands steady despite his age. "His oxygen levels are low. I'm giving him a shot to stabilize him, but he's dehydrated. He needs fluids." He reached for and for, his movements precise. "It's a good thing you got here when you did." Keanu didn't answer right away. He just watched, his mind replaying the events of the night, the cold refusal, the judgmental stare of Dr. Whitman, the feeling of helplessness as he was told to go somewhere else, and now here he was, in a place far smaller, with older equipment. And yet, in the presence of a real Dr. One who saw life before policy, compassion before protocol. The old vet glanced at Keanu as he worked. "Where did you go before coming here?" he asked, though there was already a knowing look in his eyes. Keanu exhaled, his voice even but firm. "The clinic in town." Dr. Harris paused for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. He nodded slightly, as if confirming something he already knew. "Whitman," Keanu gave a short nod, "turned me away." The vet let out a slow breath, shaking his head as he adjusted the four. The receptionist, still standing near the doorway, shifted uncomfortably. "I tried to stop him," she said softly. "I told him it wasn't right." Dr. Harris sighed. "It never is." His voice carried the weight of years of knowing, of seeing the same thing happen again and again. "That man's been in this town for decades, and he's forgotten what this job is about. He only helps those he thinks deserve it." He turned back to the dog, his eyes softening. "But an animal in pain doesn't care about who owns them. And neither should we." Keanu nodded, his respect for this man growing by the second. The vet worked in silence for a while, stabilizing the dog, checking his vitals, ensuring that the worst had passed. Slowly but surely, the German shepherd's breathing evened out. He was still weak, still not out of danger, but he was no longer at death's door. He had a fighting chance. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Harris finally stepped back, wiping his hands on a cloth. He met Keanu's eyes. "He'll make it," he said simply. Keanu felt his chest loosen for the first time that night. He reached out, running his fingers through his dog's fur, feeling the warmth return to his body. Relief flooded him, but it was mixed with something else, the lingering sting of knowing that tonight could have ended very differently. Dr. Harris leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "People like Whitman. They don't change. But that doesn't mean the world has to be like them." His gaze was steady. "People remember kindness. They remember the ones who do what's right, even when no one's watching." Keanu nodded slowly. He had learned this lesson long ago. It was why he had always lived the way he did, why he had always chosen kindness, no matter how cruel the world could be. Outside, the night was still dark, but it no longer felt suffocating. There was hope now, a lesson learned. And somewhere across town, in a brightly lit clinic with expensive equipment and locked doors, Dr. Whitman had no idea that his actions tonight would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. But here, In this small house with an old wooden sign swinging in the wind, a good man had done the right thing. And that was all that mattered. What do you think? Have you ever witnessed someone being turned away when they needed help the most? Do you believe kindness will always be remembered, or are there too many people like Dr. Whitman in the world? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in doing what's right, no matter the cost, don't forget to subscribe. More stories like this are coming soon.